Happy New Year, everyone. Today's webinar, being brought to you by AEP TAP, is a re-record of the October 30th Assessment to Instruction webinar. Due to unforeseen technical issues, we had to re-record this webinar. However, we will provide all of the content that was recorded previously on October 30th. Now I will turn it over to Jay, who will get us started with today's webinar.
Thank you. We'll go ahead and go through this. Starting with the agenda here, we'll be talking a little bit about CASAS assessment. This is not the CASAS assessment training, but a quick overview. What this covers mostly is that second bullet, competencies, task areas, and content standards. That is, within CASAS assessments, we have some embedded information that you can use to inform instruction. We'll also get into some considerations with testing, some things you might do to maximize these results, and then again putting it all together to use your test results to inform instruction. At the end, we'll also look at resources. Primarily, those are things we have available on our CASAS website. If you know our website, there's a section of our website called Product Overviews, Curriculum Management and Instruction, which contains a section on competencies, a section on content standards, and so on, that pretty much gives you everything you wanted to know and more about these CASAS-related concepts. Overall, with assessments, I won't read this to you, but these are all the positive attributes of using CASAS. The long story short is you can use it for ABE, ASE, and ESL learners, and we've gone through the very rigorous psychometric process to be approved for federal reporting. That's obviously why you're using it, so you can use it for WIOA 2 and AEP reporting. Before we get into the main meat of this presentation, a little bit on our new assessments. As many of you know, we have new assessments. We have the called the GOALS series. You can see the acronym at the top, Greater Opportunities for Adult Learning Success. A lot of you have heard last February we did have the reading assessment approved, and we are waiting for math. So a quick little overview, again, beginning of February last year, we did receive approval from the feds. In April, we submitted our math field test information and are still awaiting feedback from the feds on that. As an aside, when we received approval in February for reading, it was approved for ABE, ASC, but not ESL. So in October, we submitted a bunch more data so it could be approved for ESL. We're also awaiting feedback from them on that. What the big content-related difference between the new goals forms and the old life skills and life and work forms you all know and love is basically this third bullet. The goals forms are related to Common Core, or CCRF. That is College and Career Readiness Standards. Long story short is the new forms are more data-driven, more evidence-based. That is following all the things that are in practice here today. For more information, there's a link if you want to get more information about our new tests. Okay, getting into the meat of the presentation. We'll start with CASAS competencies in general when we bring this up to folks. Just about all of you have heard about this, but here's the overview of competencies. The definition you can see on the slide is measurable learning objectives written in a functional life skills context. Making a long story short on competencies is we have over 300 basic life skills. What I like to say is it's the basic skills that our students need, really not our students, that we all need to know to survive in that big bad world out there. We have over 300 areas that comprise those areas. We've divided them into 9 general categories. You can see the categories here. For the most part, when people see the categories, they're very straightforward. Pretty much the areas we all agree are the areas we need to know. But we basically have divided the life skills into these areas, and we have a 3-digit number that provides that detailed competency. So I'll move to the next slide to explain it a little bit better. We've got, we've got what I call the drill down approach. So we have what's called the content area. That's that broad category: healthcare, employment, government, et cetera, the general areas in which we have. If you drill down, we have the 2-digit number. That gets into a little bit more detail orientation. And then we drill down another step to the competency statement. That's the actual CASAS competency. That is that 3-digit number that's the very specific skill that we all need. So the example here, content area 3, healthcare. If you drill down one step, 3.4, health and safety procedures. Drill down yet another step, 341, interpret product labels. 342, identify safety measures. That is, you drill down to that 3-digit number until you get to that detail orientation that comprises that very specific skill needed to, needed as a life skills in day-to-day life. So you can see in the orange box, that's the beauty of why we make such a big deal about these competencies, is that when we develop our CASAS test forms, we associate at least one competency to every single CASAS test item, usually more than one competency. So at the end of the day, when an individual student or a class full of a group of students completes their testing, you can then relate all the different items that students got right and all the areas that they got wrong and break it down by competencies so you can start to address the individual or collective strengths as well as the individual or collective weaknesses that your student or group of students have, as a result of taking their CASAS assessment. Okay, here's the same information in another slide. This is straight from the downloadable list. Again, we've got the broad content area, the slightly more detailed competency area, and then the very specific competency statement. Also embedded in all CASAS test forms are what we call task areas. The task area has more to do with the format of the test item rather than the underlying content. So the example I always like to give for task area is a lot of times you'll hear folks at the teacher area say, when I look at content, I really can't discern any real differences in how my students perform, but if you look at that format, it makes a difference. The specific example you'll hear a lot is, when my students get items in straight sentences or straight paragraphs, my students do just fine. But if you put that same content in the form of a chart or a map or a graph, my students really, really struggle. If that sort of analysis, it makes sense to you or rings a bell, then you may want to look at task area. Task area basically breaks down the information in the same way, but breaks it down according to the format of the test item rather than the underlying content. So you can use the same general reports to look at task area just like you can when looking at competency. Here are the different task areas. You can see we have 5 different reading task areas and 4 listening task areas. Obviously, the number of different ways we format the items, much smaller, set of options than what we have for underlying content. But again, you can look by article or paragraph, by map and chart, by price tags, etc., to look at, how your students might perform either individually or collectively according to how that particular test item may be formatted. The third and final way that we can use to look at this is by content standard. So we look at the underlying content in 2 different ways. Again, competency is one way. The other is content standard. The long story short is competencies look at it in terms of life skills context and look at those day-to-day tasks and organize all the items using that lens. Content standards, on the other hand, look at the quote-unquote academic skills rather than the life skills. So a real common criticism of CASAS testing is, hey, my students, can do CASAS, it's okay, but it doesn't really help my student because my students need academic skills rather than life skills. So obviously we at CASAS would disagree with that. What we would say, however, is if you're looking at just competencies, that analysis might be accurate. But if you look a step further, CASAS includes academic standards just like it does life skills. But the issue is you need to look at the reports that organize the content by content standard rather than looking at those reports that relate to competencies. So again, the content, just like we do with competencies, we align every single CASAS test item to at least one content standard. Frequently, we align it to more than one content standard, but there are reports in Enterprise that organize the test results by content standard in the same way we have those reports in Enterprise that organize it by competency. So again, content standards are the quote-unquote underlying academic content. So in general, the way we organize this is the way most people would expect. We have probably to most people, most obvious academic areas: reading, listening, math, writing, and speaking. We have specific content standards that relate to each of those 5, academic content standard areas. Reading is the one that I'm most familiar, so I'll focus on that one. You can see in that first box, we have the 9 different areas of reading content standards, and I'll just point out, we use the same drill down approach for content standards just like we do for competencies. So the broad area in my example would be that academic area of reading, and then if you drill down, we organize those different reading skills into 9 different categories. If you drill down yet another step in this R1, R2, and so on, you'll get the specific content standard statement. So R1 is the general content standard area. If you drill down, we would have R1.1, R1.2, and so on that would represent the specific content standard statement. What I'll add here is not absolute, but in general, the lower that content standard number, the more basic skill. So looking at the reading areas, R1, R2, you can see things like beginning literacy and phonics, vocabulary. That is, those lower numbers address the really lower level academic areas, where if you get to R7, 8, 9, you can see it gets more advanced. So R1, R2 are things literally like reading from left to right, identifying numbers, identifying letters of the alphabet. Once you get into R2 and R3, you get into more advanced, slightly more advanced concepts like abbreviations and contractions. When you get up to R7, 8, and 9, you get into more advanced areas of reading, such as transitioning from paragraph A to paragraph B, being able to understand the content that you just read, and so on. Okay, so again, kind of tying all this together, we at CASAS would say there's no one way or the other. We always recommend using content standards and competencies in unison. Again, they address completely different areas. So again, we use the content standards to address the academic skills, and then we use the competencies to address those skills in a functional life skills context. Okay, looking at the website here, here's a screenshot. We can't really zigzag around, but here's a screenshot of that area on the CASAS website. I'll just point out, most of you know our website. We have that section called Product Overviews, and then within that section, we have that area called Curriculum Management and Instruction. The Curriculum Management and Instruction section of our website includes different areas that address all the different types of things we're talking about in this session. If you look at those little blue links, you can see there's an area on content standards, an area on competencies. There's other things like quick search, skill level descriptors, and so on. All of those, quote-unquote teacher resources are all found in this Curriculum Management and Instruction section of our website. So the example you can see here, if you want more information, you can download PDFs that have way more information on things like competencies and content standards there on the website. Okay, so transitioning out of that area and into some basic assessment information. This slide is one that a lot of you have seen. This is the basic assessment process. We start with the screening or appraisal. Then we go ahead and immediately get into pre-test. We provide those 70 to 100 hours of instruction, and then we administer the post-test to monitor that growth and try to be able to document the fact that the instruction we're providing really is resulting in growth for the student. Starting, looking at appraisals versus progress tests. On the appraisal side, to be clear, we usually use two terms. Just to clarify the terms, one term you've probably heard is appraisal. The other is locator. Just sticking to the way we apply it in CASAS, when we use the term appraisal, we're generally talking about that old pencil paper binder we had where we basically determine student placement. But when we use the term locator, we're primarily talking about that feature we have in CASAS e-tests. In general, one of the big reasons why we always recommend e-tests is you have that quick little locator you can do, or the shortcut locator, where you can get the placement done for the student, usually in just 6 or 7 questions. So what this is showing you here in this slide is the appraisal or locator gives you what I like to call the ballpark figure. That is, when you do just the appraisal or locator, that will not give you any detailed information about that student's level of performance, but it will at least give you the ballpark figure so you at least know what the correct pretest form is to give the student. And it also gives you information about things like classroom placement and program placement. Once you complete that appraisal or locator, you want to immediately do that pretest. Once you do that pretest at that specific designated level, that's what will give you the more detailed information about that student's level of performance. Okay, and here's just stating what I just said. Again, the appraisals give you that general information, program level placement, classroom placement. Then that pretest is that anchor test that really establishes what that student's performance is upon enrollment. Then once you do the instruction with the student, any subsequent test you administer is considered one of the different post-tests for that student. Okay, then we do the pre- and post-testing, obviously, to document the student's level of performance and meet those accountability requirements. But here's what we were getting at the start, is you can also use these test results to inform instruction. One big way you can do that is relating them to competencies, as we said. We can also do that by relating the test results to content standards. Okay, before we get into the specific TE reports, I'll also point out skill level descriptors. We pointed out a few slides ago you can download these different skill level descriptors from the website. We have descriptors for ABE, ESL. We also have different versions for the different modalities such as reading, listening, and math. But the skill level descriptors provide in positive terms, as you can see on the slide, what that student, quote unquote, looks like. So I like to say skill level descriptors are useful as kind of a translation form. That is, on the skill level descriptor document, it includes that CASAS scale score. It also includes that basic CASAS level of A, B, C, or D, and then it also relates that CASAS-related information to the federal level for either ABE or ESL. For teachers, we generally say this is a very useful document because at the teacher level, the teacher may or may not understand the CASAS scale scores. The teacher may or may not determine those different federal levels, but if you read the skill level descriptors, all teachers understand very well that written narrative for each level. So if there's any confusion point about the federal level, and or any confusion point about how we align our CASAS scale score, you can use these skill level descriptors to easily determine by scale score or by federal title what type of student we're talking about at each of those different CASAS or federal levels. Okay, so now I'm going to move into some of the specific reports in TOPS Enterprise that help with this process. The first one is called Next Assigned Test. Most of you are using this one whether you know it or not. If you're using eTest, this is the report that's embedded in eTest that automatically determines what test to give the student next. If you're one of those agencies that's doing pencil paper testing, obviously there's nothing automated for you, so you can run this next assigned test report, and you can see it just provides a basic roster format by student, giving the student's name, basic information about the test, what form they did, what date they took the test, what their score was, and then over on the right-hand side gives you that very specific CASAS form to administer as that post-test that would appropriately follow up on the pre-test score they got. Okay, the next one is where we're spending the most time here, but it's called the Class Performance by Competency. This is the one that most of you probably know the best. This is the one that by far the most people use in the using test results to inform instruction. But what the Class Performance by Competency does is it obviously at the class level basically organizes students' test scores by test form and basically organizes it by competency. So you can see on the slide, it gives you a separate page for each CASAS test form, and then on that page it just organizes that information by item number. So here you can see the example for Form 83R, that is a B-level reading form, and it just lists it starting at item 1 and going from item 1 to 28, item by item, and giving you information about each individual test item. You can see over to the right, it gives you that 3-digit competency number that we explained earlier, and then over to the right, it also provides that description so you know what that competency number is addressing. And then the beauty of this, again, is more on the left-hand side where you see that column called correct, where, again, in this example, it's organizing it by class. You can see we have 25 students in this class that completed this test form. So what it's doing is going item by item and giving you the percentage of students that got each item correct. So for example, if you look at item 3, you can see that addresses competency 413, use information and job descriptions and one ads. You can see in this case, we might have some issues. Only 38% of the students got this one correct. So if you're the teacher of this class, you may decide that we really need to do more related to job descriptions, one ads, and so on, because the test item that addressed that area clearly is an area where our students are struggling. On the other hand, if you look at item 9, that addresses competency 147, interpret information about home maintenance. For that item, you can see 84% of our students got that one correct, so that might be an opportunity to pat yourself on the back, where for that particular area, obviously our students are performing very well. So again, by looking at this information, you can identify by student, by class, or by entire agency. You can go at many different levels to look at areas of strength and also address areas of need based on how students are performing on those CASAS forms. Okay, so moving along, one thing that's worth looking at is in the TE report setup window. Again, we don't have time to dig into the details in the enterprise software, but just know in that software for this report, there's an area called student answer aggregation level. If you're a TE person, this is probably familiar. If not, this definitely will not be. But we get into this detail a little bit to show when you're running this specific report, there are actually 4 different ways of running the same report. You can see we have these 4 different radio buttons with 4 different titles. I'm not going to get into all the mechanics here, but I do want to point out when you run this report, there are 4 different ways of running this same report, 4 different ways based on different levels of detail. You can look at Test item and competency, for example, represents the way you'd normally do it, where it just runs from item 1 on down. Test and competency, that's what we're showing here as a slightly different alternative, where it's basically just looking at all the items using the same competency. There's also a way to do it by category, where it will kind of do a broader view and look at the 2-digit competency category number rather than the 3-digit competency number. And then there's also a way of looking at it by task area, where you can run the report based on format of the test item if you prefer it that way. Okay, here's another example, competency category. In this example, you can see we use that 2-digit number instead of 3-digit number, where we kind of gave the 40,000 feet view, where we're looking at it, by general category. The advantage of doing it this way is it usually gives us a bigger N, where the number of students in each individual represented in each percentage is a big percentage. That ensures the fact that it really means something, but of course it provides much less detail. So again, using these different things in the setup window, we can govern lots of detail versus not as much, depending on what our needs might be. Okay, and then here's an example of how we ran it by task area, where again it's giving areas of strength and areas of need based on task area or test item format rather than competency or the content of the test. Okay, looking at the next set of reports, we have a very similar framework for content standards, just as we do for competencies. Like we said a few minutes ago, for CASAS competencies, we have reports in TOPS Enterprise that you can run by agency, you can run by class, or you can run for individual student. We have the exact same sets of options of reports that you can run for content standards. So again, from a mechanical perspective, the way you would run it for content standards is basically the same as what you would do for competencies, but that underlying content is going to be different, as we explained earlier. For competencies, we're talking more about life skills areas, where again, for content standards, we're talking more about quote-unquote academic areas. Okay, so here's a way where you can see for the content standard reports, there's 2 basic formats here. Again, this is some TE details that we're not going to get into in this webinar, but if you know TE, we have set up windows for these reports just like the competency reports, and the 2 big ways you can run these reports is by test item or by test. You can see here's screenshots of those 2 different ways. One way uses this, what I like to call the dots format, where you can look for each individual item and get a rundown of each content standard represented by each item on that test form. There's another more roster format, which I have to say is the more popular format, where you can just run it by content standard and get that percentage of the content standard represented in that particular test form. Okay, so moving on to some other resources here, we have sample test items. So this is back in that curriculum management and instruction section of the website that we showed maybe 10 or 12 slides ago, but we have sample test items. What this is for is, you've heard a lot of us at CASAS use that slogan, don't teach to the test, meaning you cannot use CASAS test items to inform student instruction. You cannot make Xerox copies for students to study, etc. What we have instead are the sample test items. As you might imagine, we strongly forbid you to use actual CASAS test forms for this purpose, but what we do have is sample test items. This is to make sure we're not disseminating information to students, obviously. That said, though, we understand a lot of times it helps students to practice the format of CASAS test forms. So again, to do that, we have what are called sample test items. If you need to review the steps of how to do CASAS testing in general, we understand that's really helpful to students, but if you choose to do that, use the sample test items on the website, never use actual test items. Okay, some other resources we have is we have a feature called Quick Search. You know, we also have some information on the EL Civics website for more information. Looking at Quick Search, this is also in that curriculum management and instruction area, but this is a feature we have online. The good news is it's totally free of charge. We do require that you have a CASAS website login account in order for you to access this feature. But again, once you register and set up your own username and password on our website, you can use this free of charge. But again, we use this to provide a database of instructional materials. And the bottom line with this is we at CASAS would say we make tests, but we don't make instructional materials. You know, we really just focus on the assessments themselves. We don't have, you know, different academic press materials like some of the bigger publishers do. But we do have what we consider to be the next best thing. That is, we have this feature called Quick Search where you can access instructional materials from other publishers if you need. So there's all kinds of ways to, once you've looked at the test results for your students, organize it by competency, by content standards. You can also do it by title, by test publisher, and so on, you know, so you can organize this information in many ways. Here's a common example where, again, once you get into this feature, there are several ways that you can search for titles. The most common way is represented in the screenshot where we're searching by competency. So you might say the most standard cookie cutter way to use this is you test your group of students. Once your students complete those tests, you can run those competency reports, or if you prefer, content standard reports. Once you run those reports in enterprises, we went over a few minutes ago, that will identify specific areas of strength and particular areas of need for your students. Once you make those determinations, obviously you'd want to, in this example, focus on areas of need. So in this example, we're saying one of the areas of need is competency 412, which, oh, by the way, is using resumes, job applications, and so on. So we're just saying hypothetically in this example, our students didn't do well on the test items that address job applications and resumes. So we're looking for instructional materials that address those areas. So by using Quick Search, we click on competencies, type in competency 412, and that spits out a big long laundry list of all kinds of different instructional materials that provide quality information on competency 412, job applications and resumes. Okay, and that's it. That's all we have in this presentation. Thank you very much.